It's spooky season, so I went to Salem, Massachusetts. Here's me at the Witchboard Museum. And I went to the visitor center and I asked about the town's Black history. And the guy behind the counter looked me dead in the eye and said, no, that's in Boston. No, friend. Black people existed everywhere, and I want to know what they did in Salem. Why? Hey, I'm Angela. I'm a professor. I wrote a book on slavery, and my research has taught me that Black people's history tends to be the first thing that is erased everywhere, so now when I travel, it's the first thing I look for. Fortunately, they were able to collect some NPS research of the Black presence in Salem, and I spent the day tracking down the places where some of the most interesting things in Salem happened. And I know what you're thinking, right? Salem is the place where Christian fundamentalists falsely accused mostly women of witchcraft and publicly tortured and executed them. And yeah, that's interesting in a horrible sort of, I'm very aware of the gravity of this next election kind of way, but beyond the witch trials, Salem is home to some very subversive Black people who changed the course of all of our history. And so this month, I'm going to tell you all about them. So part 1 was Tituba. Part 2 was the Salem slave trade. Hey, by the way, that one includes an insurrection where a human trafficker from Salem gets wrecked. And today, we're going to do one of my most favorite topics, the Black Abolitionists of Salem. Yeah, you heard me right. I know in school, outside of like the 10 minutes we spent on Frederick Douglass, I didn't learn anything about Black abolitionists, period. In fact, I'm ashamed to admit I thought that white people ended slavery. And all of that says much more about the inadequacies of our educational system than it does the reality of our history. So let's explore together, shall we? So Black abolitionists existed everywhere because, well, frankly put, slavery is completely unnatural and barbaric. And both enslaved and free Black people everywhere organized in favor of abolition. But what was so different about Salem, as you might have gathered, is that 2 of the most famous abolitionists of this town were women. And this one, Charlotte Fortin Grimke, is going to get her own talk because we have a lot of material on her. First up is this seafood restaurant, which I did not eat at because I have a professor's salary. But it wasn't a restaurant in the 1800s. It was the Salem Lyceum at 43 Church Street. And there are 2 types of lyceums. The one in Salem was the type of institution that hosts public lectures, discussions, concerts, and other public education initiatives. This hall is where the Salem Female Anti-Slavery Society met, and it was home to these 2 deeply famous Black abolitionist women, Charlotte Fortin, at the time, she'd become a Grimke later, and her best friend, Sarah Parker Redmond. It was here where they discussed having to fight a war on 2 fronts, one for the liberation of their race, and another for the liberation of their gender. As an aside, a couple of months ago, I helped to arrange to have Dr. Margaret Washington, an expert from Cornell, on the relationship between Black and white women suffragists, speak here in Nashville. She explained how after the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil War, these Black women from Salem moved from anti-slavery organizing into pushing for universal suffrage. So their story doesn't even end with abolition. She told us how in 1869, Congress would give people fighting for equality a choice. That wasn't really a choice. Either Black men could have the vote, or women could, but not both. In the end, most of the Black women activists got burned by the white suffragists they had built with, and they came to the conclusion that I think many still would come to today, that if this choice has to be made, Black women would be better off fighting for men's enfranchisement than for white women's. In other words, they chose their race over their gender. And before you have feelings about that, might I remind you that historically, this is something that white women have always done, right? That's why when you break down votes by gender and race, you see a lot of white women voting against women's rights in exchange of securing their white privilege. Oh, I'm gonna get too mad to continue, so I better change the subject. So when I was walking through the streets of Salem, it really made me think about how in making that decision to force the choice between Black men or white women, Congress effectively drove a wedge between us, right? And this wedge is a wedge that our nation's leadership keeps kicking every time it looks like we might be close to success. But hey, once you see it, you can't unsee it, because it's true every single time. You're welcome.